Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Bible, and I will be facilitating this Individual Assistance Virtual Symposium. We'd like to welcome you and want to let you know that we look forward to engaging with current and future stakeholders in a conversation about how FEMA can collaborate with its partners to grow in a shared understanding in our capability to respond to and recover from disasters. Before we begin, I'd like to turn it over to Emily Rogers, who will go over logistical information. Emily?
Hello, my name is Emily Rogers, and I will be assisting Jennifer in facilitating this virtual symposium. Before we begin, I would like to share some information to help make for a smoother symposium experience. And please forgive my reading, but there are numerous details, and I want to make sure I get it right. This symposium is being interpreted into American Sign Language and will be captioned in English. Therefore, you will see an interpreter on the screen with the symposium speaker or presenter. If you would like to view closed captioning, it is available live at the link shown in the screen. Our staff has also put this link in the chat. As a result of the interpretation and captioning, please expect the speakers to pause during their remarks, presentation, and the transition between speakers to allow our interpreters and captioners adequate time to rotate during the symposium. To ensure all features of today's symposium are accessible, we recommend using a laptop. All participants will be muted and will have video disabled. We will not be able to unmute any participants during this webinar. Please use the questions box to submit additional questions for the facilitated question and answer portion of the webinar. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, please send a message in the questions box, and one of our technical support specialists will work with you directly to help troubleshoot the problem. You can also email webcastinfo@cadmusgroup.com for assistance. Our staff will put this email in the chat now. This webinar will be recorded and posted online at a later date. The link to this recording will be sent to all registrants once it is posted. The recordings from the January and March IA symposiums have been posted on the FEMA YouTube channel. The links to these recordings will be shared in the chat. Throughout this symposium, we welcome your questions and comments. Please use the questions box to ask questions to our presenters. Questions that are not answered during today's symposium will be answered after the webinar and sent to all registrants at a later date. If you'd prefer to communicate with FEMA's Individual Assistance Division outside of the question and answer box, we invite you to email us directly. Our staff will drop our email address in the chat now. Our email address will also be posted numerous times throughout the symposium for your use and reference. Today's agenda, presentation, are available to download in the Handouts tab of your GoToWebinar panel. To view the materials, please select the link and download the material. Jennifer, back to you.
Thanks, Emily. It's my pleasure to introduce Tracy Brasher, our Acting Individual Assistance Division Director. Tracy, over to you.
Tracy, we're unable to hear you.
All right, let me check again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll start over. My apologies. Good afternoon or good morning if you are joining us from another time zone. Thank you very much for your attendance today in joining our third session of FEMA's Individual Assistance Symposium in a series of 4. I am Tracy Brasher, the Acting Individual Assistance Division Director, and I would like to warmly welcome you to today's conversation. Today's sessions will cover and highlight 2 important topics that have significant impacts on FEMA's mission of supporting people before, during, and after a disaster. The first being the IA declaration factors. When FEMA is determining whether to include individual assistance in a major disaster declaration, We are reviewing and considering many factors, including state and local government's fiscal capacity, available state and local program resources, private sector and non-governmental organizations' capacity, extent of uninsured households, and impact on community infrastructure. Today, we will cover each of these in the IA Declarations Factors discussion. The second topic that we will be covering today will be about preliminary damage assessments, which are conducted to help federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial partners determine the magnitude of damage and the impact of disasters. The process starts at the local level, where damage details are initially collected and with state, tribal, and territorial authorities. Additionally, PDAs help determine if the effective level of response is beyond the capabilities of the state and the affected local governments, and that federal assistance is necessary. Today, in the PDA discussion, we will discuss these topics and provide resources and templates related to this topic. I hope you will find these two discussions informative and helpful to you as you continue to serve communities. I know working in emergency management takes a lot of dedication, and your commitment to disaster survivors is extremely appreciated. Our job as your leadership team is to always look for ways to help improve the speed, accuracy, and effectiveness of the variety of assistance types that we provide at the state, local, territorial, tribal, and federal level, and we will continue to do so. Thank you for taking time to join us. As always, your participation and insights are critical to our mission. And I will turn it over to Emily to introduce our first speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy, for your opening remarks. I am pleased to introduce the following presenters to provide information on IA declaration factors. John Carlton, Individual Assistance Acting Senior Advisor for FEMA Headquarters, and Maya Davis, Lead Emergency Management Specialist for FEMA Headquarters Declaration Section. John will be providing information on IA declaration factors and will be joined by Maya to answer any questions. John, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Couple things I want to cover today are the IA declaration factors, and this slide represents the 6 current IA declaration factors that FEMA uses. These factors were published in 2019, and these factors replace the previous factors of concentration of damage, trauma, special populations, voluntary agency assistance, insurance, and average amount of individual assistance by state. And that correlated to a table that was in the federal register, the federal regulations, which identified the average cost of IA assistance per state. These factors that are currently on the screen are broken down by 6 distinct factors. The first 2 factors are considered primary factors. The remaining factors, which I've identified as secondary factors, are not necessarily considered secondary factors, but they are the additional factors that comprise the whole 6. The 2 primary factors, the state fiscal capacity and resource availability, and the insured, uninsured home and personal property loss factors, are going to be used to come up with what's known as the cost to capacity ratio, and I'll talk about that in just a little while. But the first 2 factors are primarily based on IHP assistance. The remaining factors are really there to support and influence the recommendation for the community services programs, which consist of disaster case management, crisis counseling program, disaster unemployment assistance, and the disaster legal services. Next slide, please. Okay, the first factor, as mentioned, is the state fiscal capacity and resource factor. And what this does is this is actually gathering information through the PDA process, and it's gathering the resources available at the state, tribal, territorial, and local resource through non-government entities, non-government organizations, through agencies such as the American Red Cross and Salvation Army and others. The data source for the capacity part of this is actually part of the state and regional assessment, and it's the Bureau of Economic Analysis. We utilize either the total taxable resources or the gross domestic product. In some cases, in some areas, the total taxable resources aren't available, and we would utilize the gross domestic product, or in some cases, neither exists, and we would utilize other factors in determining capability and local resources. The additional information that's gathered here through the local, state, tribe, and territory are what other available resources can be brought to bear to support the recovery of that disaster. Next slide, please. This factor is the uninsured home and personal property losses. This information is obtained through the PDA process, and using the PDA workbook, the estimated cost of assistance is calculated. And I know we're going to be talking about PDA in just a little while, but this is where we actually start coming up with the cost of assistance needed to support individuals and families in response to that disaster. Next slide, please. Disaster impacted populations. Generally, this information is obtained from the census data and validated through the PDA process. This information can be obtained to track local level data right down to the local areas of impact. So the census data can be broken down into various tracks so we can get the most up-to-date information and most accurate information from the affected area. Common elements that we collect for demographic data include low income, elderly, disabled, English proficiency, existing government programs such as the food and nutrition, supplemental food and nutrition program, and Social Security information. All of this is gathered to identify what additional needs may be needed in support of recovery of that impacted area. Next slide, please. This slide here really talks about the impact to community infrastructure. And this information is obtained, again, through the PDA process, and it's gathered from the state, tribe, and territory, and local assessment. FEMA considers the disruption to life-saving, life-sustaining, and essential community services that have impacted the individuals and families, and to identify additional needs from the community. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide here is talking about casualties, and we don't necessarily just talk about those that were deceased as a result of the disaster. We're collecting information on those that are missing and those that are injured as a result of the disaster. Again, the information is collected initially through the PDA process, and we start identifying what some of the needs may be to support family members and support expenses associated with deaths, injuries from the disaster. Next slide, please. Okay. This slide here is really talking about disaster related unemployment. Again, this focuses on the impacts of the disaster to individuals who had lost work as a result of the disaster, but don't necessarily qualify for the regular unemployment assistance. In other words, those that are self-employed, and what we've seen in other events is where you have an entire industry that isn't supported by the state unemployment system, such as fishermen or other type of professions that generally don't pay into the unemployment insurance. So FEMA starts looking at what other assistance may be needed to bring to bear to support disaster unemployment assistance as a direct result of that event. Next slide, please. This is the template of when a state, tribe, or territory provides information, makes a request through the region to the president. The region begins to look at that request and put it into a template form. And that template form is broken down by the 6 categories or the 6 factors, along with a lot of additional detail to support each of those factors. Typically during a request, the state will have to tell the story of what the impacts were to the local communities and what effect it had in their capability to recover. So this template simply identifies each of those factors and places within each of those factors a series of details to support the request. What you also see on this slide is the matrix, which is down in that right-hand lower corner. That matrix is based on historical information. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, but this is part of how we develop the cost to capacity ratio. Next slide, please. This talks about the factor, and I'm going to focus a little bit here on the cost to capacity ratio, which is part of the makeup of that matrix. This is based upon historical data that has been collected by FEMA for several years that includes all disaster requests and where the cost of the disaster, where the cost of the IHP program fell within the state resources. I mentioned earlier that talking about the state capacity and the resources, we talked about the total taxable resources or the gross domestic product. That is used in developing the formula to identify and consider where that disaster would land in the historical perspective of all other disasters that have been developed. You can also see on this slide, it's a recap of the principal factors, the primary factors for individual assistance, and the additional factors that really help support those community services programs. Next slide, please. This slide here actually depicts the calculation used in coming up with that cost to capacity ratio that is placed into the matrix. You can see here that the top number is the estimated cost of IHP. This information is taken from the PDA, and as mentioned, this is based upon the uninsured homes and the disaster needs, as well as personal property losses. We gather all that information during the PDA, and in using the PDA workbook, it comes up with the calculation of assistance, estimated cost of assistance for individuals in households program. That is the numerator to the actual state TTR. That is the total taxable resources, which is usually identified in the billions of dollars, and it's divided by 1 million. And then you take the cost of the IHP assistance, divide that by the ratio, and that comes up with the dollar amount. If I could go back one screen, I'm going to show how that is represented in the matrix. As you can see, that matrix, the cost estimate on the top line of that matrix, that is the IHP cost of the disaster. That is the information derived from the PDA. On the side where it says cost to capacity ratio, that is the ratio that I just showed you on the previous screen that comes up with a specific number. Placing the cost estimate of IHP over the cost to capacity ratio, that identifies us in this matrix of being starting from the dark green all the way up to the dark red. The gray area represents those disasters that were comparable in size, and if the ratio and cost estimate falls within the green area, typically what we do is we will go back to the state, territory, or region and get additional information to see if anything was overlooked. But this actually is only used as an indicator. It is not a primary factor in determining whether or not a recommendation will go forward for granting a disaster. This is only an indicator as to where this disaster lands within the historical data gathered by FEMA over the years. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And that concludes this presentation, and I welcome any questions that you may have in answering any questions on the IA declaration factors.
Thank you, John. John and Maya will now answer some questions that have been submitted. Again, if you would prefer to communicate with FEMA's Individual Assistance Division outside of the questions box, we invite you to email us at the email in the chat. Jennifer, over to you for some questions.
Thanks, Emily. We have one question so far, and I'm just going to read it. It is my understanding that the IA declaration factors were updated a few years ago to provide more objective criteria, clarify thresholds for eligibility, and speed the declaration process. Since these new factors have gone into effect, have these three objectives been met? The thresholds for eligibility are still not as definitive as public assistance, nor does the declaration process seem to be any faster.
Sure, I can start to answer that, and then I'll turn it over to Maya. Yeah, essentially with individual assistance, there is no threshold. Unlike public assistance that does carry a threshold. What occurs with individual assistance, during the PDA process, the teams gather as much information as they can regarding the impacts to the affected area. For individual assistance, as mentioned, there is no threshold. All of these factors are taken into consideration when determining and validating the information that's received in the request. The matrix that I just talked through a little bit kind of gives us an indication as to where this new request falls within that historical data for all other disasters. Using a threshold is something that FEMA has never wanted to do. Declarations are at the president has the authority to grant these requests, and what FEMA does, working with the regions and state, territory, or tribal government, is really gather and tell the best story of what occurred in that event and what are the resources that are needed from the federal government to be brought to bear to support recovery. So in terms of the new factors, as mentioned, these factors had been published in 2019. Prior to that, they were slightly different factors, even though a lot of the information is very similar. But the factors do help solidify more precisely what is gathered and what is used to be considered when looking at declaration requests. And I think I answered all the questions.
I believe so. Thanks, John. We do have one more question at the moment, and that is, how is equity considered in these declaration factors? And how is it factored into the cost to capacity? And sorry, lots of questions coming in, so I lost my place here. Just one moment. All right, let me say that again so that I get it all together in one question. How is equity considered in these declaration factors, and how is it factored into the cost to capacity and cost estimate matrix?
In terms of the way we currently look at equity through through indices and other forms of looking at equity, those have not necessarily been directly factored into these IA declaration factors. However, using the census data, a lot of the information that's used in some of the indices is also used through census data. So we begin looking at the vulnerable populations and the vulnerable communities based upon census information, and we start looking at what impacts may be included, or what impacts are affecting some of those populations. And we start considering those populations in support of making a declaration request. So it's not, we haven't implemented anything specific to equity at this point, although there is a work group in headquarters that is looking at equity and how to factor equity into the declaration process. but a lot of that information is currently being utilized through the census data and how we look at the impacts to those communities and vulnerable populations as we consider the request in processing.
Great, thanks again. Next question. Can you go into a little more detail regarding insurance? How much data do you need regarding the amount of people uninsured or underinsured? Does this data come from the damage assessment solely?
Yeah, that's a great question. Insurance is a real tough category to get accurate information on. For years, FEMA has been trying to come up with a way to accurately depict the coverage of insurance in any situation. Unfortunately, there is no central database that would allow us to pull accurate information. So information on insurance is gathered through a couple different means. It's usually gathered during the PDA process. It's talking to the local government on what some of the insurance coverages may be for that local area. It's also looking at some of the information that can be gathered through census. We also start looking at, the amount of mortgages that are currently in play. There's no definitive way of capturing insurance information. It was also mentioned, how do we capture the underinsured? Underinsured is something that we can't necessarily capture because it's almost ill-defined. It's not defined anywhere. Typically what occurs when a declaration has been granted and FEMA starts collecting information from the individuals through the application process, and we send inspectors out to do their inspection, we will try to verify the insurance. If someone indicates that they have insurance at registration, they're also automatically going to be sent a letter saying that you should be covered for the peril, depending upon what the event was. And once they receive their documents back from their insurance company, they are to submit those documents back to FEMA, and FEMA will determine if we can assist them beyond their insurance assistance. And a lot of times, with FEMA now, with the financial assistance caps being raised, we really encourage individuals to submit their insurance documentation very early in the disaster to get them back and send to FEMA to see if we can provide them any assistance above and beyond what insurance settlement is. Underinsured is a term that we use quite frequently, but it's really difficult to determine that during the PDA process or during the declaration request process. It's something that usually occurs after the event when applicants start receiving their insurance settlement documents, and then they can send those to FEMA to see whether or not FEMA can assist them in any way.
Thanks, John. We have a few more questions here. They keep coming in. So next question, excuse me, let me go back up a little bit. Is there a historical document available or other analytical information that can be shared regarding the correlation between the IHP projected costs based on PDA and the actual? Do they generally trend higher, lower, or about the same? Understanding some events are ongoing when the PDAs are completed and other factors.
Yeah, great question. There's nothing definitive at this stage. However, we've been working with our recovery analytics division to really look at the PDA data information and then compare it to the post-disaster declaration information. We are seeing some trends, although more work is needed. But on some of the trends, we happen to see that in large events, sometimes the assistance is, let me see if I get this straight, it's underestimated in relationship to post-disaster events. But in smaller events, it's overestimated, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of work that is being done with our recovery analytics division to really look at the gap that exists between information collected at PDA and post-disaster awards. And maybe during the next session when we talk about PDAs, they may be talking a little bit more about this.
Great, thanks, John. We'll move to the next question, which is, when there is a denial for IA declarations, states don't receive thorough written feedback. Is there a plan to change this?
That might be best answered by Maya from the declarations section.
Yeah, that is something that has been recently talked about and is, I guess the best way to say it is, overworked and worked through with the OR front office. It is the SOP and the Stafford Act to give certain information. So it'll be something that they are working with OCC and things like that to not give what in some cases could be pages of information on why, as John's been explaining on how things are done. So that is something that they are looking into, and they have been looking into over the last 12 months, I'd say.
Thanks, Maya. We'll move on to the next question. Is there a way we can preload census data by county on our templates or worksheets? Maybe this is something we can do in our regions. And this question comes from a regional representative.
Yeah, no, once again, yeah, we continue to work with the regions on how we can improve that data collection process through PDAs and census and what have you. A lot of times census data may be collected it can be collected at the state, county, parish, all the way down to individual tract data. So depending upon how the regions want to work that, they may be able to preload it into some of their data so that when they get the request from the state, they could populate it that way. But again, there's really no easy way to do that because disasters are so unpredictable as to where they may occur.
Thanks, John. And next question, with the new factors in place since 2019, has there been an increase of IA declarations versus before the change? Please provide insight if these changes have been more favorable or less favorable to the state, territories, and tribes or not.
Again, maybe this might be something that Maya might be able to address.
Yeah, I figured that this one would come up. The OR analytics team is currently working on getting several data sets together for items. On a personal level, I can say there have been more IA requests. We haven't done the research, and like I said, we're working with the analytics team to see if there is a new trend, but there's definitely a trend for IA requests.
Thanks, Maya. That is all of the questions that I have in the chat. Appreciate your on-the-spot answering both to John and Maya. I can wait a second or two more, see if any additional questions come in. Otherwise, we will move to our next topic. But one just came in, so here we go. If we had a PDA and it doesn't include ownership or insurance data, can we use historical data available along with the data from the PDA for damaged homes when submitting a request?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because there's so many different ways of which information might be able to be gathered through local officials and elsewhere. Again, I used to do a lot of PDAs when I was in the region, and however we could collect the information, as long as you're able to validate why that information was collected that way or how it was collected, that would suffice. Again, this information, a lot of information isn't just readily available, but through census data, through local emergency officials. I know a lot of times when PDA teams go out, they're going to team up with the local EMA director or possibly the fire chief, police chief, or someone in an official capacity that will have better information into that particular local area. So as long as you're able to collect the information, validate it as best you can, and explain how that information was gathered, that's something that, for lack of a database or a system where you can draw from, that's how I would recommend having that information.
Thanks, John. That is helpful. And we have one more question. Please explain the appeal process. Thanks.
Again, that might be best answered by Maya.
Here again, the appeals process is exactly the same as the declaration process. So in an appeal, once they receive their turn down letter, they have 30 days to submit an appeal. The appeal has to come from the governor. Everything is done exactly the same. In the appeals process, you are looking for a favorable declaration, you'd be looking to include more information. So in an appeal that comes in with no new information, that's likely, it's possible to result in the same. So in appeal, it's better to include more information to bolster the state's case.
Yeah, and just to highlight that again, from a programmatic standpoint of review, we always look for what additional information is being provided in the appeal that wasn't included in the original write-up. We have to look for something different, something that, because again, the decision was already made on the original request. So what in the appeal is different from the original, and what additional damages have been identified.
Thanks to you both. Next question, what factors are most attributable to conveying the severity and complexity of the disaster? And how is severity and complexity weighted against the ICC ratio and the TTR?
The correlation to the TTR and ICC ratio, there really isn't one at that stage. The complexity comes in the write-up of the actual request. So when the governor is making the request, they look at those situations and unique circumstances that would make this disaster more challenging or more complex. So that is part of the narrative that comes along with the request and the regional write-up. As I mentioned, the template that's used, that's only a template that is within a document that also is a narrative. It gives the story of what occurred. So the factors take into account some of those complexities, but really we want the state and the region to focus on, well, what makes it unique? What makes it more complex? And they exist. Those circumstances exist. We just need to be able to understand that story to be able to put those into some of the factors. But there is really, I don't want to say any one of those factors stipulates or highlights the complexity, but together they show what the impacts are and the scope of the event. Magnitude is where we start getting into some complexity, and that's where it usually requires additional write-up or narrative as to what else is going on that the factors don't capture.
Thanks, John. Next question, is the narrative and regional write-up weighted the same as the ratio and TTR?
Well, I'll go first, and I'll let Maya also weigh in here, because again, I think in terms of reviewing the documents when they come in, the first thing we do is we read the request and the write-up from the region, and then we go to the matrix to see whether or not, or we go to the template to see whether or not all those elements are captured in the template. Of course, you have the primary factors that will most likely drive the event, but when we talk about going back to the complexity issue, the remaining 4 factors are where you really start to delve into what additional needs does the government have to bring to bear recovery, because there may be a lack of capacity or a lack of resources to support that event. So that's where your complexity starts to build in. But in terms of is it weighted differently or equal? I can't necessarily say one over the other. It's how it's presented and how it's written. And again, when the state is about to make the request, typically headquarters and the regions are on the phone and we're coordinating so that we get a better understanding of what those impacts are, and we can support each other in making sure that the story is being told in the correct way.
And so I'll piggyback off of that. To give a more concrete answer, I know in the region they'd like to have, they are very equal. So to give an example, if you submit a state request that has a lot of information and then your write-up comes in and it doesn't address any of that information, we can only use at FEMA validated information. So we can't just go from the state's request. So it is severely important to have that write-up to go along with that spreadsheet or that workup. It has to be the validation. That's what FEMA uses. So yeah, I'd say they're equally as far as where I'm sitting when we write this package up that has to be submitted to the White House, knowing that we're following the SOPs and the Stafford Act, we have to use the information that has been validated by the regional FEMA representatives. So I'd say yes, and quite possibly could be more important to have a real write-up. So I know you guys are going to ask, I know it's coming, so I'm going to lay it out there now and then we can get to it later. But the regional recommendations that we receive that are low in information are harder to work with, and the reason why we reach back out, because we have to have validated information from FEMA. We cannot just use the governor's request. So yes, I'd say if they're not 50-50, then I go, maybe the write-up is 55%, because then you are signing your name that you have validated the information that was contained in the governor's request.
Thanks to you both on that. This will be our last question for IA declarations, so we can move on to the next presentation. So this last question is a little bit lengthy, so my apologies. Is it still considered, or was it ever, a requirement to go back and conduct PDAs after an expedited IA declaration was made for catastrophic type events? Was it ever never clear why this was done, and why resources were allocated when actual data generally already exceeded post-event PDA projections? Regulation, policy, best practices, good idea or not, or is it necessary?
Well, I'll speak programmatically that in a big event where it's an expedited declaration, we always went back out and did damage assessments post-declaration. That is really used to help support staffing requirements, program requirements, and coordination requirements with other federal agencies and volunteer organizations. It's very challenging that without having a sense of true impacts and the effects of that event, to manage that event. So typically in big events, we always encourage people to go out and do those damage assessments so that we can have a better understanding of magnitude and provide the proper support in that disaster recovery.
Also to be noted that in an expedited request, there could be 5 areas that were included in there. So in an expedited request, it doesn't cover the entire state or even the entire damaged areas. So the PDAs are needed to see that now we have another area that we couldn't reach maybe when it was expedited. So that's used as well.
Well, John and Maya, I very much appreciate your expertise on IA declarations, and I'll turn it over to Emily to introduce our next speakers. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am pleased to introduce the following presenters to provide information on IA preliminary damage assessments. Amit Patel, Emergency Management Specialist for the Preliminary Damage Assessment Unit in FEMA's Recovery Directorate. Jarrett McLean, Emergency Management Specialist for the Preliminary Damage Assessment Unit in FEMA's Recovery Directorate. And Malcolm Hardy, Program Specialist and IA Preliminary Damage Assessment Lead for FEMA's Region 2. Amit, Jarrett, Malcolm, you have the floor.
We'll turn it over to Malcolm to start us off. Malcolm, over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. So the previous presentation was very fortuitous for our presentation. I was asked as a regional representative to talk through some of the regional aspects of this. So we'll get more into the specifics of some of the questions that were asked and some of the processes that kind of feed the declaration. So next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, a lot of our processes are built around, regulations, Stafford Act, et cetera, that feed this declaration process. So we as individuals who are executing PDA processes will go and base a lot of this, a lot of the items of the damages we are assessing or validating on these kinds of processes. So 44 CFR 20633 addresses PDA specifically. This is kind of the core of what we look to that guides the process of what we're doing. And if you go to the next slide, we have our, at least specifically for our region, the kind of items that guide the CFR, which we just mentioned. Also the FEMA's preliminary damage assessment guide, and also our regional recovery divisions preliminary damage assessment and declaration process guide and manual that we at region kind of keep and inform our processes on. Go to the next slide. So much as was mentioned earlier, this is specific to the process of how a declaration, a preliminary damage assessment process would happen, with heavy emphasis on the front end incident and the initial damage assessment process. In region, usually we are reaching out to our state counterparts to assess, to ask if what they're doing, how they're doing, what their operations are. There's an apparatus that supports the states in their implementation of their own programs, but we would be early on in the process identifying and talking to our state counterparts about, what has been their impacts. Are they looking at doing damage assessments? Are they overwhelmed? Do they need technical assistance and guidance to support this? And how are they going to work through the process of identifying IA PDA data, and will they be requesting a joint preliminary damage assessment? And if you move through to a joint PDA, this is the process that was articulated in the previous session, where, FEMA region is deploying resources to support the state in identifying, and FEMA would be validating the damage in that process. But, you know, these things don't just happen. So we're going to kind of talk through a little bit of how this process works specifically to at least our region, but likely many of the other regions too would follow through with similar processes. So next slide, please. So what was mentioned earlier, this is the RVAR, the Regional Administrator's Validation and Recommendation. This is a template document, so it's not an actual RVAR, but you will note that there is key information attached to this that goes up to through the declaration process. But the reason that this is important to us is that, you know, if we're assessing damages to inform a declaration, it's pretty important to know what we need to put in the documents to inform the kind of damage collection and data collection that we're doing in the field. So in our processes, we're going to be validating legal requirements. We're going to be looking at what we're finding in the field. And this is usually a process that's done in our region by what's called our declaration team. And usually if an RRCC is stood up, there might be a DEC specialist attached to that, which would be working through this process. But if in a smaller incident where no RCC stood up, someone inside the recovery division is going to be working through this process with myself and other IA PDA leads on building out this document for the process of that declaration. But we are going to be informing our PDA process through these kinds of data mechanisms. Next slide, please. So these are kinds of the essential elements of information that we look for within our PDA planning components. You know, when we're looking at working with our state partners to organize a PDA process, we're moving through to look at the date the request is made, the reason and the type of incident, the incident period. These are all things that go into the subsequent documents. A summary of initial damage reported by the state, tribal, territorial governments. This is where what was mentioned earlier becomes very relevant in the sense that the more robust our information collection process is, the easier it is for the declaration teams and the subsequent people up at headquarters to review the documents, and the less questions might be asked and the more upfront knowledge of will this get declared or not declared you have, because you have the right information in the process and you know kind of what you're doing. Also into the more field-oriented process, we're going to be working through the anticipated dates of the PDAs. You know, who is going to be conducting it, the PDA leadership, who's going to be coordinating, who's going to be leading teams, what is going to be the process for reports. This is all worked in concert with our state counterparts when the state identifies an IA PDA lead from the state side, the state, tribal, territorial. Once we have that kind of ironed out, we're going to go through the team placement. We're going to look to involve other FEMA regional divisions. It was discussed insurance before. Oftentimes, if we talk to our mitigation division, we can get flood insurance data. EHP and external affairs also have roles here. Sometimes if we talk to our state partners, they can work with their consumer affairs divisions or other entities throughout their state to get more granular insurance information on the communities that's beyond what you would normally have in a demographic summary from a census data pool. We're also going to be looking and analyzing, this is potentially the most important thing, about methodology. We're going to be having discussions with the state based on, you know, what method of assessment is going to be the most valid for us being able to validate impacts. In-person, virtual, hybrid, paper survey, or our Survey 123 system. And we're going to be looking at, you know, different components of each process for which is more worthwhile or even possible in whatever current framework we're working through for the incident. And we're also going to be looking at other pertinent information that we might want to have. Next slide, please. So this flows into the IA PDA data piece. Now, It's very granular because, you know, you're having teams, you're looking out, you're doing things with the states, but we are looking to validate state impact summaries, and we're looking at these key areas. So we're looking at the cause of damage, we're looking at the jurisdiction that the damage occurred in and where might have concentrations. We're looking at the number of homes impacted and the degree of damage, whether or not it's minor, major, destroyed, or inaccessible. We're looking at the types of homes, whether or not they are manufactured trailers, whether or not they are single family classic dwellings, or whether or not they are multifamily dwellings. This will give us insight into impacts. We're also looking at home ownership rate and of the impacted homes to kind of go back to what was presented with the two primary areas of what we're looking at for our impact factors. We're also looking at the percentage of affected households with insurance, which we talked about before. We're also looking at inaccessible communities. If we cannot access them to do damage assessments, the homeowners likely cannot get access to their own properties or get access to communities they might need to leave their properties through. We will also be working with other partners in identifying special flood hazard areas, sanctioned communities, coastal barrier resource system zones, and protected areas to kind of feed into our PDA teams to know what we're looking at, and if there's anything specific attached to that that's beyond just, is this house damaged or destroyed? And we're also going to be looking at other relevant PDA data, such as the aforementioned items like census level, income levels, vulnerable populations, trauma, and special circumstances. And this would be where we would be factoring in equity components and other items in our consideration of how we're looking at validating impacts for the states. Next slide. So we have gone through a bunch of the information on, you know, kind of our PDA processes at least a regional level. So I'm going to pass it back off to Ahmed and Jarrett, who are our esteemed headquarters teams that support us in this process, to talk about the kind of resources that I might be calling them up and asking them for in a pinch to kind of help us do our PDAs here at Region.
Thank you, Malcolm. Yeah, hi everyone. Amit Patel, nice to meet you. I work in the preliminary damage assessment unit here at the Recovery Directorate at headquarters. As Malcolm stated, our unit's primary purpose is to support the regions as well as SLTT partners with any available resources and tools and data that we can help to, you know, simplify and expedite the PDA process. Next slide, please. So one of the first resources that I'd like to state and, you know, make available to everyone is for SLTT partners who are not aware or do not typically know how to, you know, request a joint PDAs to the FEMA region. We have developed an optional PDA request template if you'd like to have, you know, somewhat of a structure as well as the ability to, you know, keep and maintain records management within your appropriate SLTT governments. So we have created that is available, and all these resources that I will be going through is available on FEMA.gov/PDA, and you'll see a link further down in the slides. Next slide, please. So we've also, based on feedback with our regional stakeholders, as well as some conferences that we've attended and conducted and presented at, we've heard a need and kind of a resource to really help STTs to identify what damage, which data in the initial damage assessment process FEMA is really looking for. And while we do understand that, you know, each state or territory or tribe has specific requirements or data that they would like to collect for their own purposes, Sometimes, we find that some regions and FEMA required data isn't actually captured, and we did create this additional resource to help you identify ways to identify what specific data fields and metrics that the region would need in the initial damage assessment process. So as the bullets state, really quick 2-page, 3-page document that really outlines the information that FEMA needs to, kind of get the joint PDA process up and running. And as stated, we do welcome any feedback or any suggestions that is, that is welcome. And we have posted our email in the chat for you guys. Next slide, please. So another resource that we like to recommend and stress, and has really come abundantly more, I guess you could say, more used and done, is during the COVID environment, from in-person PDAs, boots on the ground in the field, due to COVID and the height of the pandemic, due to safety precautions, regions have resorted to conducting hybrid assessments or even full virtual assessments, and we have adapted that within our PDA guide, as well as additional resources for our regions as well as SLTT partners to utilize. So aerial imagery is very critical now. I think we can say that not only is it impactful for in-field assessments, but can also provide an SLTT with situational awareness, as well as identifying specific neighborhoods or areas that have been impacted post-disaster or post-incident. And so we do have this the aerial imagery resources that we work with our response geospatial office here at FEMA headquarters, as well as FEMA regions and their GIS coordinator to make this imagery available for you. And a lot of that imagery is also can be accessed on FEMA.gov/PDAs. Next slide, please. So this one, the IHP Individual and Households Cost Calculator, is a resource that we've made available to SLTT partners to kind of determine the cost of individual assistance and how much a projected cost of an IA declaration may project. This is purely, for kind of like a situational awareness, as well as an estimation tool that can be utilized when requesting joint PDAs, as well as can be utilized during the declarations process. And we work very closely with the Individual Assistance Division, as well as Mr. Carlton, who presented earlier, and the declarations unit to, kind of tone and make sure we are capturing as much information as possible. And this calculator is in an Excel document, which is available on the website, as well as across the other areas within the IA portion and deck factors within the FEMA.gov website as well. And so this document allows you to estimate housing assistance as well as other needs assistance for each county, and you list out how many counties are impacted, the number of destroyed, major, minor, and affected, as well as utilizing census or even insurance information that you're able to directly validate and input that into the calculator and get potential IHP cost projections that can be utilized in the declarations request process. Next slide, please. And so we do have some PDA virtual online training courses that is available to SLTT partners. There's one, and that is the IS 772.A for individual assistance PDAs, which is an overview of IA PDAs and how the deck process does operate and the team roles and responsibilities. I would definitely recommend, having, utilizing, your partners, or as well as your team members taking this course to, familiarize themselves with the process and the roles of how a joint PDA is conducted. As well as we have a 556 damage assessment for public works, which is primarily kind of fixated on the more public assistance, critical infrastructure side. And then we also have the 559 local damage assessments, and this is more of a somewhat of a response-esque damage assessment to get situational awareness. But the PDA unit, as well as what we've been trying to strive forward, is to really utilize a lot of the assessments that are done during response as well as during the joint PDA phase to inform each other and really help you in identifying areas to target and refine your long-term recovery process. One of the things, actually I don't have a slide for this, but one of the factors that I do want to state is that the PDA unit is currently in the very preliminary stages of updating now it will be the 2022 PDA guide. We did release the 2021 PDA guide effective October 1st last year. Since the creation of the unit, we've been working and getting a lot of feedback, and we are working with a variety of stakeholders to refine and update and modernize the guide to really target the new ways of assessment technologies, as well as some of the areas that we can really build on, and a lot of the questions that we do get on a policy aspect regarding PDAs, and this would be applicable for IA and PA as well as our tribal stakeholders. So you can go to the next slide, please. I am done here, and I will transition over to my colleague, Jarrett McLean.
Thank you, Mick. Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. I just have a couple slides. On the team, I preliminarily work on the technology options that we offer our regional folks who are out there conducting the PDAs with you all. So I wanted to just show a couple of the things that we make public for you guys to use if you're interested in adopting them. They're 100% voluntary, but we've seen a lot of increased interest over the years from non-FEMA partners in using digital solutions for conducting the damage assessments and collecting the data that we've talked about here in the last 15-20 minutes or so. And these templates are based on the street sheets that you may be familiar with that FEMA has used and published for many years, and that collect the data that Malcolm covered in his portion of the discussion a little bit ago. So if you could go to the next slide, we'll talk about the surveys a little bit. Wanted to first start off and say that, of course, we use one particular version of software for collecting this data in-house here at FEMA. There are multiple different versions or multiple different software types out there that folks have developed that offer custom solutions for not only collecting basic data, such as what the damage is rated, as we talked about earlier, in presence of insurance or owner and renter information, but there are also some on the market that allow you to build in custom solutions or custom questions, I should say, for some different things that you might need to collect in-house. So for local jurisdictions, if you have financial information you need to collect as you're going out there for local purposes or for your own internal purposes, they can build those forms in there for you. So this version that we use, we make the templates that we use to put together our digital surveys for our staff. We make those publicly available there on FEMA.gov/PDA, as Amit has referenced for other resources so far. And this allows our teams to electronically collect the data and then submit it. As long as they're online, they can submit it right away. If they don't have a self-service connection where they are, we do a lot of PDAs in areas where there are where there's no cell signal, or where there's everybody's offline. They can collect that data and it will sit in an outbox until they're either back at a Wi-Fi hotspot or in a cell service area that they can submit it. And then the coordination staff back at the regional headquarters can validate that information as it comes in and affirm what the tallies look like and what they're seeing, the field teams are seeing out there. So it allows our folks not to have to juggle paper anymore. You're out there in the rain or in the snow trying to record damages on paper. The paper gets wet and wrinkled, gets smudged. There's data entry piece to that. You bring the paper back to the office, then you have to type all of the information into an Excel document to either email off to someone or send to somebody to review. Sit there with counterparts afterward and compare to make sure all the data is okay and it looks correct. Here, it's already in the system. It's already digitized, and we can just go down through and find any anomalies very quickly to see where the missing home might be if one was missed on one form versus another. So we can transmit that data back and forth pretty easily. Of course, once it's in an Excel document, not just for sharing within the team, but sharing back and forth between agencies. If somebody wants to see a copy of data that we've received or vice versa to make those comparisons, that's pretty easy. And then internally here at FEMA, we have the ability to share data widely within other programs. As you may know, there are different programs that do different things and have different software solutions for managing that data. This allows us to already have the data digitized. It's not sitting on someone's desktop somewhere. It's in a place where we can transmit it back and forth from one step of the program to another. And then we can also perform analysis on it down the road to make sure that our programs are staying on the right track and we're able to collect the data we need in order to appropriately validate the damages that you all have seen. And it standardizes the collection of the reported damages across the different levels of government. So if states, tribes, territories, even local jurisdictions collect the data in a similar manner, it can transmit up and down in a very standardized manner. And as he said earlier about collecting different types of information, we've got that baseline that we talked about during the checklist piece that we need in order to make those calculations on the cost calculator. He also talked about and seen how these pieces now start to fit together. If we can get that baseline of information, that's really helpful, especially if it's collected during the IDA. You can validate that a lot faster than having to kind of sit back and gather either a data set or go out and talk homeowner to homeowner. So that information is helpful if it comes up to us after the IDA phase, can kind of speed things up a little bit. And then data sent to us, we can also collect a geodatabase file, a .gdb file, or a CSV file, which is a comma separated values file, type of Excel file that we can upload into our system, and they can review the data in our system if it's using the same template. Of course, you don't have to necessarily use the template. We like it if you do. But B, if you choose to take the template as a starting point, if you're looking to get into the digital data collection world for damage assessments, you can at least take this template and modify it if you want. We don't have any rules or restrictions against use of the template. It's out there and free to use. We've taken the time to develop it for internal purposes, and we want you to be able to take advantage of that. So if you don't have access to extensive GIS resources, you don't have to reinvent the wheel and spend a lot of time and effort setting up a program. Next slide. And how to access these templates, again, they're on our website, like a lot of the resources we've talked about today. There is that link, FEMA.gov/PDA. At the top, our web team has put together some breaks for us within the web page, and I've circled the one in the image that says digital damage surveys. Those are available. You can click on that. It'll jump down to the middle of the page where those are located. They're downloadable in an Excel file format, and if you have GIS staff, they can take that file, that template file, and upload that in behind the system and kind of get you started. Recommend that you have a relationship or develop a relationship with your GIS or geospatial professionals in your jurisdiction to kind of help you out with that. And this allows you to, again, collect the data in the same manner as we do. That I think is all that I just wanted to mention too. We do occasionally put out updates. We just had one the other week, working with our web team to make sure that those are up there. Keep checking back over the next week or so just to see if there's any further updates. But occasionally we'll reorder some things, or we're working on some updates to some calculations for later this year. He mentioned that we're working on some updates to guidance, hopefully coming out next year at some point. So. As things evolve, as we get feedback, as things change, we make some tweaks to our surveys, but they largely collect the same amount of information that they have over the years. We just kind of maybe add a little bit of granularity here or there. And again, you can weed out any questions that don't pertain to you, or you can add stuff that is specific to your jurisdiction. Next slide, please. And then we want to take an opportunity, I think we were going to do this anyway with a question and answer session, but just to hear your feedback. So on the next slide, we've got a lot of resources, we've got a lot of tools. A lot of them are for our regional partners because they're the ones conducting these operations. They're the ones interfacing with you all, and we're just supporting them. We're backing them up with anything that we can, whether it's technology or guidance or training. And then the same would go for external, anything that's external resource. So it's on our website, and we want to know how we're doing, or is it helpful? Is there anything? Are there any gaps? Anything that we need to address, and maybe a new type of fact sheet or a new checklist? So whether that's guidance, training, technology, anything related to field operations and coordination, or just other gaps. So we're interested to hear what your feedback is, and I think like the presentation before. Jennifer will take care of that through the chat. But Malcolm or Amit, anything else you wanted to add to what I had to talk about before we go to the feedback?
I believe you covered it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks to
yeah, thank you, Jennifer. I'll let you take it away here. I was just going to say is our contact information, and I believe we may have had a message posted in the chat for you that if you've got any questions about any of these or feedback that you prefer to send us rather than put in the chat, there's our contact information, our web address, and our email contact. So go ahead, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jarrett and Amit and Malcolm. We do have one question, but there's probably more coming. But the first question is, we were recently told that the Red Cross typically provides some type of damage assessment to FEMA within 72 hours of a declared incident. 1, is this true? And if so, 2, how does the information collected from the Red Cross overlap with the type of information the state collects for an IDA?
Malcolm, you want to take the first stab at it?
So typically, yes, our Red Cross partners do conduct damage assessments. Their process is somewhat different to ours because, like I said, you know, our process is validating state reported information. Theirs is more frontlining impact summaries. So they're interested in impacts to households from a Red Cross perspective to turn on their programs or work out things independent of FEMA's process. But it is unlikely that, you know, FEMA is going to be getting a Red Cross report that our state IA counterparts that are working in an EOC at the state level are not going to be getting also. It is going to be overlapping in the sense that it is going to be informing the IDA process in a way, the initial damage assessment process, and then also going to be giving us certain level of information that we will be working with our state partners on validating in their reporting process on the other areas that we're talking about through that's less specific to our damage level and quantitative information.
Thanks, Malcolm. We don't currently have any questions, but we can give a few moments to receive any questions the audience may have on this topic.
So one thing that I'll elaborate on, similar to the Red Cross is not the only entity that's out there doing assessments, right? And one thing that I don't think we did through this process is talk through the other elements that are useful. So a damage assessment process doesn't just inform a declaration, right? This helps us do strategizing on a disaster. For an IA, so if I'm deployed to work with my state counterparts as an IABD or like an incoming branch director, I'm going to be using my PDA process to tell me and inform likely areas that I'm going to be targeting for outreach, or it's going to help me build out my staffing levels for my operation. And the state's going to be doing a similar thing. And my state counterparts are going to be looking at it from the standpoint of, well, what's our strategy to do this with our current resources? That's going to help them kind of prep the deck for the kind of resource thresholds that were talked through in the declaration process. Do we have enough current resources to handle this? That's likely a predicate to, our PDA process, but there's lots of agencies out there that will be conducting their own versions of assessments on whatever impacts. So the more partnerships you have with them, the more relationships you have, the better you are at collecting and understanding how they're organizing their information, and that will help to feed the damage assessment process in a more expeditious and unified way. And there's lots of agencies out there that do this stuff.
Okay, we still don't have any questions in the question box. So we'll give it a few more moments. And I know that silence equals agreement here a little bit, that the presentation was so extensive that all the questions have been answered. So just want to thank Amit, Jarrett, and Malcolm for their time today and expertise on PDAs. And we look forward to having this information shared and being available to everyone here on the call. We have a comment, very informative presentation, and mahalo. I will give that reference to that participant. And others have also said great information and thank you. So the job well done, answered all the questions. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I recognize that there were some questions that were put in the registration information when you registered. We will be answering and responding to those questions when we provide the summary report and this webcast on our YouTube channel. So stay tuned for that. But I will hand it back to Emily for closing comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. As we conclude today's session, there will be a few questions that pop up on your screen. Answering these questions is voluntary, but we really appreciate any feedback that you provide, as it will help us to improve future IA symposiums. They should be popping up on your screen now. We'll allow a few seconds for each question before we transition to the next one. Again, we really appreciate any feedback you provide, as it will help us improve future symposiums. We have 2 more questions, and we appreciate your feedback before we move into our closing remarks. As we move into our final question, again, we appreciate all your feedback. Thank you so much for all of your feedback. We greatly appreciate it. Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our closing speaker.
Thanks, Emily. It is my pleasure to introduce Blair McDonald, our acting IA Deputy Division Director, who will provide closing remarks. Blair?
Thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate it. Good morning and good afternoon. As Jennifer said, I'm Blair McDonald, the Acting Individual Assistance Deputy Division Director, and I would just like to take this opportunity to thank our presenters and participants for attending the third IA Virtual Symposium for 2022. IA has committed its time and resources in hosting 4 virtual IA symposiums that support the individual assistance work of state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. Your past and future participation is vital in building relationships and creating better ways for FEMA to serve you. Today's sessions highlighted the importance in determining whether to include individual assistance in a major disaster declaration and how to determine the magnitude of damage and impact of disasters. We hope that the past 3 individual assistance virtual symposiums have been informative to your planning processes. We look forward to your participation in our 4th and final 2022 IA Virtual Symposium, which is scheduled for Thursday, July 22nd, 2022. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to our Individual Assistance Office of Regional and Field Coordination. The email address is FEMA-HQ-regional-field-coordination@fema.dhs.gov. We very much appreciate and value any input that is received. Once again, thank you for taking the time today to join us. As always, thank you for your participation, insights, and expertise, as they are vital to our mission, helping people before, during, and after disasters. Have a great day.
Thanks so much, Blair. Appreciate your closing remarks. Just as Blair mentioned and want to clarify, the last virtual IA symposium will be held on Thursday, July 21st. So just want to be clear, the 22nd is Friday, so it will be Thursday, the 21st of July. As always, our presentation will be posted on the web and on YouTube, and we will send that link once that is available. And lastly, we always would like to hear from you. So if you have topic suggestions or ways to improve these sessions, we look forward to that feedback. So again, really appreciate your time today in sharing this information so that we can share this information with you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And this concludes today's symposium. Thank you very much.